She didn't cry. She didn't run. She laughed. And that's when everyone knew they made a terrible mistake. Tonight, in a ballroom filled with 300 of New York's most powerful people, a man gets down on one knee. Not for his wife, but for her younger sister. He expects tears. He expects humiliation. He expects her to break. But Vivian Whitmore has been waiting 6 months for this exact moment. She already has everything she needs to destroy him. And she's not alone. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most, stay until the end. This story is for you. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The dress had been hanging in the closet for 11 days. Vivian hadn't touched it after the first fitting, hadn't adjusted the straps or smoothed the fabric or done any of the small obsessive things she used to do before an event that mattered. She simply let it hang there, silver white against the dark closet wall, and went about her days with the kind of flat, deliberate calm that her housekeeper Elena found unsettling enough to mention twice. "Mrs. Caldwell, are you feeling well?" "I'm fine, Elena." "You haven't eaten since yesterday morning." "I said I'm fine." She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine in 6 months. But fine wasn't what she needed to be tonight. Tonight, she needed to be exact. Vivian sat at the vanity in her bedroom and looked at her own face without flinching. Something she'd had to relearn how to do. 41 years old, high cheekbones from her father's side, the kind that photograph well and age even better. Eyes the color of old amber, currently holding the particular blankness of someone who has cried everything out and is now operating on something colder and more durable than grief. She picked up the mascara wand and applied it with a steady hand. Outside the bedroom window, Manhattan moved the way it always did. Indifferent, relentless, lit up and loud. 32 floors below, yellow cabs ground through intersections and suited men checked their phones on sidewalks, and the whole enormous machine of the city kept turning without caring in the slightest about what was happening in this room. She put down the mascara wand and picked up the single piece of paper sitting beside the jewelry case. She didn't need to read it again. She'd memorized it weeks ago. But she read it anyway, the same way you press on a bruise to remind yourself it's still real. It was a wire transfer confirmation. 7 figures. From an account held jointly in her name and Ethan's, moved to a private holding company in the Cayman Islands, that she had eventually, after 3 weeks of digging through financial records with a forensic accountant named Gerald Marsh, who charged $400 an hour and was worth every cent, traced back to a shell entity whose sole beneficial owner was her husband. She folded the paper and placed it back in the false bottom compartment of the jewelry case. Then she put on the silver earrings her father had given her on her 30th birthday and stood up. The dress fit the way it was supposed to. That was the only good thing she said about it. The Hargrove Hotel had been built in 1924 by a railroad magnate whose name appeared on 3 different streets in Midtown Manhattan. The ballroom on the 14th floor could seat 320 guests at round tables draped in white linen, and tonight every seat was full. This was ostensibly a 5th anniversary celebration, their anniversary, hers and Ethan's, which meant the guest list had been assembled by Ethan's personal assistant and included almost no one Vivian would have chosen herself. Business partners. City councilmen whose votes had proven useful. A federal judge who golfed with Ethan on alternating Sundays. The kind of crowd where everyone knew everyone and information moved like electricity through copper wire. Vivian's town car pulled up at 7:14 p.m. She sat in the back seat for a moment after the driver announced their arrival, looking at the hotel entrance through the tinted window, the red carpet, the doormen in their brass-buttoned coats. The photographer already stationed near the door because Ethan had hired press coverage for his own anniversary party, which told you something essential about the man. She got out of the car. The photographer raised his camera. Vivian walked past him without breaking stride. Inside, the ballroom hummed with the particular sound of money at leisure, crystal touching crystal, practiced laughter, conversations that were simultaneously social and transactional. A string quartet played something from the far corner. The flowers were white orchids, Vivian's favorite, which Ethan had chosen not because he remembered her preference, but because his assistant had a file. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and did not drink it. She spotted Ethan immediately, the way you always spot the person you've been married to for 5 years. Not because you're looking for them, but because your nervous system has learned them the way it learns a sound or a smell. He was standing near the far end of the room with his back partially turned, talking to a man whose name Vivian knew, Garrison Pierce, a hedge fund manager who'd been doing business with Ethan's firm for the better part of a decade. Ethan looked good. She had to acknowledge that. Tall and broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that had been custom-made by a tailor on West 54th Street, dark hair going silver at the temples in a way that he'd once complained about, and she'd once found attractive. He was 46 years old and carried himself like a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. He hadn't seen her yet. She used the time. Charlotte was at the table's second from the left, near the window. Vivian found her sister with the same mechanical ease and felt the same thing she always felt now when she looked at Charlotte. Not anger exactly, not the scalding white-hot thing she'd expected. Something flatter. Something like looking at a photograph of a person you used to love and realizing the feeling is mostly just evidence of how wrong you had been. Charlotte was 36 and had always been the beautiful one by their mother's accounting, which was a deeply specific and revealing type of cruelty that Vivian had spent most of her life absorbing without naming it clearly. Charlotte wore a green dress tonight. Her dark blonde hair was pinned up. She was talking to the woman beside her and laughing. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of someone who believed they were safe. Vivian watched her laugh and felt nothing move in her chest. That was how she knew she was ready. She worked the room for 40 minutes. She did it the way she'd been taught to do it, by a mother who ran social functions the way military commanders ran campaigns, efficiently, strategically, leaving no one unaddressed who might later prove useful. Vivian shook hands and accepted compliments about the flowers and deflected questions about whether she and Ethan were planning to travel for their anniversary, and the whole time one portion of her mind was completely elsewhere, tracking exits and sightlines and the position of the 3 people she'd arranged to have present tonight who were not on Ethan's guest list. Gerald Marsh was seated at table 9, introduced to the venue coordinator as a family friend. He had with him a briefcase that contained paper copies of every document Vivian had collected over the previous 6 months. A woman named Dana Kress, a former assistant district attorney who now ran her own white-collar criminal defense and investigation firm, was seated at table 12 under her actual name because Ethan didn't know who she was. The third person had not arrived yet. Vivian checked the time, 8:02 p.m. Ethan would move to the podium at 8:30. He liked to keep people waiting long enough to feel the anticipation, but not so long that they started to get restless. She found herself near the bar and accepted a fresh glass of champagne to replace the one she'd been carrying as a prop. "You look like you're calculating something." She turned. The man beside her was someone she recognized vaguely from previous events, silver-haired, somewhere in his late 60s, with the careful eyes of someone who'd survived a number of things. His name was coming to her. "Robert Hale," he said, apparently reading the slight pause. "I do some advisory work for Garrison's Fund." Vivian Caldwell. She used the name without hesitation, because tonight she needed to be exactly who she appeared to be until she chose not to be. "Anniversary party," Robert Hale said. He looked around the room with an expression that was diplomatically non-committal. "Must be a good marriage." Vivian said, and let the sound mean whatever he needed it to mean. He drifted away. She exhaled. At 8:11, she felt the atmosphere in the room change before she understood why. It was subtle. A slight shift in the volume of conversation, a few heads turning toward the entrance, the particular attentive stillness that a crowd produces when something unexpected enters its field of awareness. She turned. Alexander Blackwood was standing at the entrance to the ballroom. She had met him once before tonight. 2 weeks ago, in a private office on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown that had no visible signage and was reached by an elevator requiring a keycard she'd been given by a man who wouldn't tell her his name. The meeting had lasted 40 minutes. Blackwood had sat across from her at a bare conference table and listened to everything she said without interrupting her once, which was the first indication she had that he was different from what she'd expected. She'd expected someone who performed menace. He didn't perform anything. He simply sat there and listened. And when she finished, he said, "Your father did right by me. I don't forget that." And then he asked 3 very specific questions about the financial structure she'd uncovered, and she answered them. And at the end, he stood up and said, "8:30 Saturday, the Hargrove." And that was all. He looked exactly the same now as he had in that office, early 50s. A face that was not conventionally handsome, but impossible to look away from. Angular, still, with the particular quality of someone who has learned that patience is a form of power. Black suit, no tie, the kind of clothing that costs enough to look like it costs nothing. He moved through the room the way water moves around stones. Not hurrying, not pausing, simply finding the path. The conversations near the entrance faltered. Vivian watched the ripple move through the room. Watched Garrison Pierce's expression shift from sociable to wary. Watched 2 men near the bar straighten almost imperceptibly. Watched a city councilman find something very interesting to look at on the far side of the room. Ethan had seen him. Vivian was close enough to watch the precise moment her husband registered Alexander Blackwood's presence, and what crossed Ethan Caldwell's face in that half-second was not something he would have wanted witnessed. It was fear, clean and uncomplicated, the kind that doesn't have time to put on a social mask before it shows. Then Ethan looked at Vivian, and she smiled at him. Just a small smile, the kind that gives nothing away. Alexander reached her and said nothing for a moment. He simply lifted his coat from his arm and settled it over her shoulders in a gesture so natural and unhurried that it looked like something they'd done 100 times before. Then he took the chair beside her, the one that had been set for Ethan's business partner, who had apparently found a reason to relocate, and picked up a glass of water from the table. "He's about to go to the podium," he said quietly. "I know." "You ready?" Vivian looked at her husband across the room. Ethan was still watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having been very afraid for a very long time and then deciding not to be anymore, that he was trying to recalculate, trying to understand what he was looking at, trying to figure out how much danger he was in. "I've been ready for 6 months," she said. Ethan Caldwell had spent 3 weeks planning what he was about to do. He hadn't told Charlotte all of it. He'd told her they were going to make their relationship public tonight, which was true, and he'd told her it would be uncomfortable for a few days, but that the business insulation he'd put in place meant there would be no serious professional fallout, which was partly true and partly wishful thinking. What he hadn't told her was the way he intended to do it, because there was a version of himself that understood, on some low and poorly examined level, that the staging he had in mind was gratuitous in a way that even Charlotte, who was not without her own uses of cruelty, might object to. He had planned to enjoy this. He'd been looking forward to the specific expression on Vivian's face when she understood what was happening, the controlled collapse, the public unraveling of the woman who had spent 5 years looking at him like he was perpetually failing some standard she hadn't bothered to articulate. He had married the Whitmore name and the Whitmore money and the access that came with both of those things. And the one thing he had never been able to purchase or manufacture was the way Vivian looked at him sometimes. Assessing, unreachable, fundamentally unimpressed. Tonight he had intended to take that away from her in front of 300 people. But Alexander Blackwood was sitting in his ballroom. Ethan gripped his champagne glass and thought very quickly. Blackwood's presence here didn't mean Vivian knew anything she wasn't supposed to know. It could be a coincidence. No, it couldn't. Blackwood didn't make coincidences. It could be a business connection. Vivian's father had had connections everywhere, had known people Ethan had never been fully able to map, even after 5 years of access to the family networks. Maybe this was old money meeting old obligation. Maybe it was nothing. The coat. Blackwood had put his coat on Vivian's shoulders. That wasn't nothing. Ethan looked at the clock above the bar. 8:27. He had 3 minutes. He could redirect, could get up there and give a different speech, something straightforward about 5 years together, something that wouldn't expose Charlotte tonight, something he could use to buy time while he figured out what Blackwood's presence meant. But Charlotte was already watching him from across the room with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding whether to be patient. And Ethan had learned the hard way that Charlotte's patience had a shorter half-life than she advertised. He straightened his jacket and walked toward the podium. The room quieted when he tapped the microphone. Ethan was good at this, commanding attention, filling space, projecting the ease of someone who was exactly where he was supposed to be. 300 faces turned toward him, which was the thing he loved most about moments like this, the certainty that he was the subject of the room. He spoke for 4 minutes about the hotel, about the evening, about the anniversary. He was charming and specific, and several people laughed at the right moments. Vivian sat very still at her table and did not look at him. Then he said, "I want to say something tonight that I probably should have said a long time ago." The room shifted. People who'd been half attending straightened slightly. A different register had entered his voice. "I've spent the last 5 years in a marriage that taught me a great deal about what I want and what I don't." He paused. "I think everyone in this room deserves honesty. And the most honest thing I can say is that I've known for some time that I married the wrong woman." The silence was absolute. Vivian heard someone's champagne glass touch a table 2 seats to her left. She heard Ethan's footsteps as he came down from the small platform and moved across the room. She heard the crowd's awareness track him like a physical thing, 300 sets of eyes following his path between the tables. She heard Charlotte make a small sound that might have been surprise and might have been delight. She heard Ethan Caldwell get down on one knee. She heard the whole room hold its breath. And then she laughed. It wasn't performed. It wasn't the bright social sound she deployed at parties, the one that meant everything was fine. It was a real laugh, low and unguarded and completely at odds with what the room had been anticipating, and it landed in the silence like a stone in still water. Ethan looked up from his knee. His face, which had been arranged for triumph, did something complicated and unflattering. "Vivian?" "Stand up, Ethan." Her voice was quiet and perfectly level. "You're embarrassing yourself more than you realize." She reached into the small silver clutch on the table and removed a single folded document. She placed it in front of Gerald Marsh, who opened the briefcase with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been waiting to do exactly that. "What is that?" Ethan said. He was still half crouched, which was not a powerful position from which to ask questions. "That," Vivian said, "is the beginning of a conversation about the $4.3 million you moved out of the estate account between March and September of last year." She looked at the room. The 300 faces now all turned toward her rather than him. "And the shell company in the Cayman Islands that you used to hold it. And the forged signature on the transfer authorization dated June 11th, which is interesting because I was in London on June 11th, which Gerald can verify." The room was completely motionless. Ethan stood up. The color had drained from his face in a way that was noticeable even at distance. Vivian picked up her champagne glass and took the first sip she'd taken all evening. Then she looked past Ethan to where Alexander Blackwood had risen from his chair and was now standing utterly still, watching the man in the charcoal suit with the patient and absolute attention of someone who has not yet decided what to do and does not need to hurry the decision. Ethan turned to follow her gaze. What he saw in Blackwood's expression, the calm, the complete absence of urgency, the sense of a man who has prepared for a very long time for a moment like this and finds the reality of it unsurprising, was worse than anger would have been. Anger was something you could argue with. This was not. "I'd sit down," Vivian said, "if I were you." Ethan Caldwell sat down. But what Vivian didn't say, what she couldn't say yet because she hadn't told anyone, was that the financial documents Gerald carried were only half of what she had found. The other half was something she'd uncovered 4 days ago, at 2 a.m, when she'd been going through the last of her father's personal papers with the kind of desperate thoroughness that only comes from not being able to sleep. What she'd found in those papers had changed everything she thought she understood about how this had started, and it pointed directly at someone whose name hadn't appeared in any of the evidence she'd shown to Alexander Blackwood. Not yet. The room did not recover. That was the thing about a crowd of 300 people who had just watched a man get down on one knee for the wrong woman. There was no graceful way back to champagne and string quartets. The quartet had actually stopped playing at some point during Ethan's speech, and now the silence they'd been filling felt structural, load-bearing, like something the room needed in order to stay upright. Ethan was in his chair. He had not moved since Vivian told him to sit, and there was something almost geological about his stillness. The stillness of something that has been struck very hard and is waiting to find out if it will crack. Charlotte was not still. Vivian watched her sister stand up from table 2 with the kind of movement that happens when the body acts before the mind finishes its calculation. Charlotte crossed the floor in her green dress, and the crowd parted for her the way crowds part for someone who looks like they might do something the room isn't ready for. She stopped 6 feet from Vivian's table. Her face was flushed and her jaw was set, and her eyes, which were a lighter shade of the same amber as Vivian's, were doing the thing they did when Charlotte was frightened but had decided to perform anger instead. "You planned this," Charlotte said. "Yes," Vivian said. You knew, and you let him—" Charlotte stopped. Something moved across her face. "How long?" 6 months. The words landed on Charlotte the way a flat palm lands rather than a fist, broadly, comprehensively. 6 months meant the conversation they'd had in March about Ethan's stress at work. 6 months meant the Sunday in April when Charlotte had come to the house for dinner and Vivian had poured wine and asked about her dating life with what Charlotte had taken for sisterly interest. 6 months meant every phone call and shared meal and moment of apparent normalcy had been something else entirely, had been Vivian sitting across from her with full knowledge and a face that gave nothing away. "You sat across from me," Charlotte said. Her voice had dropped. "For 6 months. You were sleeping with my husband," Vivian said, "for considerably longer than that." The room produced a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite silence, something in between, the involuntary exhale of 300 people absorbing information they hadn't asked for. Charlotte's mouth opened and closed. Then she said quietly, and with a precision that Vivian recognized as genuine, "I thought he loved me." And Vivian looked at her sister. Really looked at her, past the green dress and the performance of indignation and the 5 years of accumulated damage, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would make that statement less true or less pathetic or less devastating in its smallness. Charlotte had believed it. That was the cruelest part. Not the betrayal of sisterhood, not the money, not any of the strategic machinery that Ethan had constructed around the affair, but the fact that Charlotte had looked at a man like Ethan Caldwell and concluded she was loved. Alexander Blackwood had not moved from his position near the table. He was watching Charlotte the way you watch something you're deciding whether to factor into your calculations. When Charlotte turned to look at him, apparently just now registering his presence with its full weight, he met her eyes without expression and she looked away first. Gerald Marsh was quietly organizing documents. Dana Kress had her phone out, not visibly, but Vivian knew she was recording the room's behavior for purposes that would become relevant later. Ethan stood up. He did it slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man reassembling his posture around a core that had been badly shaken. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Vivian, then at Alexander, then back at Vivian, and when he spoke, his voice had found a register that was calmer than his face suggested it should be. "Whatever you think you have," he said, "you need to think very carefully about the next step you take." "I have thought carefully," Vivian said, "for 6 months." "Vivian." He said her name the way he always said her name when he was trying to remind her of a dynamic he believed existed between them. The slight downward inflection. The proprietary weight. There are things in those accounts that you don't understand, business structures, legal arrangements. You pull one thread and you expose things that will damage you as much as they damage me. "Which things specifically?" He blinked. He hadn't expected the question to come back that quickly, that precisely. "The Meridian account," she said. "Or the transfers to the holding company in Nassau? Or the Series D investment in the Aldrich Fund that you structured through the estate without my knowledge or consent?" She tilted her head slightly. "Pick one." Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked again at Alexander. "Who is this to you?" "Someone who knew my father." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight." Well, Garrison Pierce had materialized near Ethan's elbow with the instinctive proximity of someone who has invested significantly in a person and is trying to assess the structural integrity of that investment. He said something low into Ethan's ear. Ethan listened without looking at him. Then Ethan nodded, once, and turned back to Vivian. "This isn't the place." "You made it the place," Vivian said. "You hired the press. You booked the room. You invited these people. She looked around the ballroom. The 300 faces still riveted, still motionless, drinks forgotten in hands. I'm simply using the venue you provided. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked out of the ballroom. Not running, he was too controlled for running, but not the exit of a man who had chosen to leave either. The exit of a man who needed a wall between himself and the room in order to think. Charlotte watched him go. Something in her face shifted as he disappeared through the door. Something that had been hoping, apparently, even now, for him to look back. He didn't look back. Charlotte sat down at the nearest table, which happened to be empty, and put her hands flat on the white linen and stared at them as if she'd forgotten what hands were for. Sung. The hotel corridor outside the ballroom was carpeted in deep burgundy and lit with sconces that produced a warm and deeply inappropriate glow. Ethan stood near a window overlooking the street, 32 floors below, and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. He heard the door open behind him. I'm not talking to you right now, Garrison. It's not Garrison. He turned. Alexander Blackwood stood in the corridor with his hands in his pockets, and the thing about him in the narrow hallway versus the large ballroom was that the smaller space made the quality of his stillness more apparent, more precise. He wasn't leaning on anything. He wasn't blocking the corridor exactly. He was simply present in it in a way that restructured the available space. Ethan straightened. I don't know what she told you. She didn't need to tell me much, Alexander said. I've been watching the Whitmore accounts for 2 years. A pause. Short, but significant. 2 years, Ethan repeated. Thomas Whitmore was a careful man. He had arrangements in place. Alexander's voice was conversational, without edges, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had been threatening. When he died, I started paying attention to what happened to those arrangements. Thomas died of a heart attack. He did, Alexander said. Doesn't mean there wasn't a conversation that happened 3 weeks before it. Ethan's expression changed. Not dramatically. He was too practiced for dramatic. But something shifted behind his eyes that had the quality of a door opening onto a view that was worse than anticipated. I don't know what you think you know, Ethan said. I know what I know, Alexander said simply. The question is what you want to do about the next 36 hours. Because what happens in those 36 hours is going to determine the shape of the rest of your life. Ethan looked at him. He was calculating. Vivian would have recognized the expression, had seen it at dinner tables and across boardrooms and in the bedroom in the small hours of the morning when he didn't know she was watching. The expression of a man running numbers. What do you want? Ethan asked. Nothing from you, Alexander said. And the specific quality of the dismissal, the complete absence of interest in Ethan Caldwell as a variable that mattered, was more damaging than anything else he could have said. He turned and walked back toward the ballroom. Ethan stood at the window and looked at the street below for a long time. Vivian left the Hargrove at 11:15. She left through a side entrance with Gerald at her right and Dana Kress at her left, and the briefcase between them, and the cold March air hit her face, and she stopped on the sidewalk and breathed it in. Really breathed it, the way you breathe after you've been holding yourself rigid for hours, and you finally have permission to let the muscles unclench. You need to eat something, Dana said. I need a drink. You need to eat something and then have a drink. They went to a diner on 8th Avenue that Dana apparently knew from her ADA days, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that arrived without asking and a laminated menu that hadn't changed in 15 years. Vivian ordered eggs and toast and ate both, mechanically, staring at the Formica table. Gerald was reviewing his notes on a legal pad. Dana had her laptop open. The footage from tonight will be on 3 different phones by morning, Dana said. Probably already is. That's fine. The financial filings need to be ready to go before he has time to move anything else offshore. She looked up. Do we have the June transfer documentation fully authenticated? Gerald has the notarized copies. I need originals for the civil filing. They're in the office safe. Vivian drank her coffee. What's the timeline? If we file Monday, we can freeze the relevant accounts by Wednesday, pending discovery. His attorneys will push back on the Cayman structure because jurisdiction is genuinely complicated, but we have enough for the domestic accounts to… Dana. Vivian set down her cup. The other thing. Dana stopped. Gerald looked up from his legal pad. "The papers I found," Vivian said. "My father's papers." "You mentioned there was something. I haven't shown it to Alexander yet." Dana closed her laptop partway. Gerald set down his pen. These were small adjustments, involuntary, the body's way of signaling that it was upgrading its attention level. "Show me," Dana said. Vivian reached into the clutch and removed a folded photocopy. She'd made 6 copies and distributed them in 6 different locations, which was not paranoia but basic operational sense, which was a thing she'd had to teach herself in the last 6 months because she'd spent the first 41 years of her life believing that she did not live in a world where operational sense was required. She unfolded it and placed it on the table between them. It was a letter, handwritten, on personal stationery, in the slanted cursive of a man who'd learned to write before keyboards made handwriting vestigial. Her father's handwriting, dated 14 months before his death. Dana read it without touching it. Gerald leaned in. Neither of them said anything for the duration of the reading, which took approximately 90 seconds. Then Dana looked up. "Who is Victor Whitmore?" "My mother's brother," Vivian said. "He's been in London for the past decade. Financial consulting, which is what everyone in that family calls it when they mean moving money for people who don't want their names on documents." "Your father wrote this letter to his attorney?" "Yes." "He knew about the irregularities." "He'd found them. 3 weeks before he died." Vivian smoothed the edge of the photocopy with her thumbnail, a small automatic movement. "He was going to request a forensic audit of the estate accounts. He was concerned that money was leaving through structures he hadn't authorized. And he thought it was Victor. He doesn't name Victor in the letter, but he names the account structure. And when you cross-reference the account structure with the shell companies Gerald identified in the Cayman documentation," she stopped. "Gerald." Gerald turned the legal pad to face Dana and pointed to a column of numbers he'd spent 3 weeks assembling. Dana looked at the numbers, then at the letter, then at Vivian. "If this letter exists," Dana said carefully, "and if the account structures match, they match. Then we're not looking at a financial fraud case with Ethan as the primary actor." "No," Vivian said. "We're looking at a conspiracy that's been running for over a decade, that my husband joined as a late-stage participant, that my sister was used to maintain access to the family through me, and that my mother has been facilitating since before my father died." She paused. "And that my father may have been beginning to unravel when he had his heart attack." The diner noise continued around them. The scrape of plates, the distant hiss of a griddle. A couple in the next booth arguing quietly about something that had nothing to do with any of this. The ordinary world proceeding. "You need to tell Alexander about this," Dana said. "I know. Tonight. I know." "Vivian." Dana's voice had dropped. "If your mother is involved at this level, if Victor is behind the structure, this is not a civil filing situation. This is potentially obstruction, potentially fraud on a federal scale, and depending on what we can establish about the timing of your father's death, I understand what it is." "Do you understand that it means your mother?" "Yes," Vivian said. The word came out flat and final. "I understand what it means." She picked up her coffee cup. Her hand was steady. She'd practiced that too. She called Alexander at 12:40 from the back of the town car. He answered on the second ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping. "There's something I didn't show you," she said. "When we met." A short pause. "How significant?" "It changes the shape of everything." Another pause, longer. She could hear him breathing, steady, unhurried. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Same building. The building with no sign." "That one," he said. He hung up. Vivian looked out the window at the city moving past. They were crossing through the upper 50s, heading east, and the buildings were the kind that had occupied their corners for 100 years and intended to continue. She thought about her father's handwriting on that letter, the slight left lean of his capital letters, the way he'd always pressed harder than necessary on the downstrokes, the handwriting of a man who took his time and meant what he wrote. She thought about what it meant that he'd found the irregularities. She thought about what it meant that he'd died 3 weeks later. She had been telling herself for 6 months that her mission was financial recovery, that what she wanted was her inheritance back, her father's legacy restored, her dignity reclaimed from the specific humiliation of having been deceived by the two people most proximate to her life. Those were the things she told herself in the mornings when she had to get up and continue. But sitting in the back of the car at 12:50 in the morning with her father's letter folded in her clutch, she understood that she had been lying to herself about the scope of what this was. This wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. Margaret Whitmore lived in a townhouse on the Upper East Side that she had occupied for 32 years, since she and Thomas had bought it 6 months after Vivian was born, and Margaret had announced, in the way she announced most things, that she intended to stay there permanently. After Thomas died, the question of the townhouse, its ownership, its valuation, its place in the estate, had been one of the first things Ethan's attorneys had flagged as requiring clarification. Vivian had thought at the time that this was administrative. She understood now that it had been positioning. Her mother was 68 years old and moved through her life with the specific assurance of a woman who had never, in living memory, been required to account for herself to anyone she didn't choose to account to. She had married a powerful man and outlasted him. She had raised 2 daughters she treated as projects with variable success rates. She had maintained her social architecture with the tireless and slightly terrifying efficiency of someone for whom reputation was not a vanity, but a working tool. When Vivian arrived at the townhouse at 7 the following morning, Margaret was already dressed. This was not a surprise. Margaret had been fully dressed before 8 a.m. every day of Vivian's childhood, which had seemed like discipline then and felt like armor now. The housekeeper, a different one from Vivian's childhood, the 3rd or 4th iteration, admitted her and said Mrs. Whitmore was in the sitting room. Vivian walked through the hallway she'd grown up walking through, past the photographs on the wall, past her father's study with its closed door, into the sitting room where Margaret was reading and did not look up immediately. When she did look up, her expression was composed. She had seen the news. Of course she had. It had been less than 12 hours, and the footage was already circulating in the ways that these things circulate, the text chains and private social feeds of the people who'd been in that ballroom. "Sit down, Vivian." "I'll stand." Margaret studied her for a moment. Then she set down her reading and folded her hands in her lap. "What happened last night was, I found Dad's letter," Vivian said. The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, a garbage truck made its way down the block, the sound arriving and departing in waves. Margaret's face did not collapse. That was the thing Vivian had braced for, and it did not happen. Her mother's face simply tightened, as if the muscles beneath the skin had decided to hold their position more deliberately. "What letter?" Margaret said. "The one he wrote to his attorney 14 months before he died, about the account structures, about the missing transfers." Vivian looked at her mother. "About the conversation he intended to have with Victor." Margaret looked back at her daughter with an expression that was, for the first time in Vivian's memory, genuinely unreadable. Not the cultivated blankness of social management, but the blankness of a person who is rapidly running several calculations simultaneously and has not yet arrived at the one that serves her best. "Victor," she said finally, "has nothing to do with—" "Stop," Vivian said. "Please. Don't tell me Victor has nothing to do with it. I have the account numbers. I have the transfer structure. I have Gerald Marsh, who has spent 3 weeks cross-referencing documents. And I have Dana Kress, who prosecuted financial fraud cases for 11 years. And I have Alexander Blackwood, who apparently knew my father well enough to spend 2 years quietly investigating what happened to his estate after he died." She paused. "So please, don't." Margaret was silent. The garbage truck had moved on. A taxi horn somewhere. The ordinary sounds. "Did you love him?" Vivian asked. The question came out quieter than she intended, not because she was controlling it, but because it turned out to be a smaller question than it looked, and small questions have small voices. "I'm not asking about the money, or Victor, or any of the rest of it. I'm asking you one thing. Did you love my father?" Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment, and then she said nothing. The silence moved into the room and occupied it completely, and Vivian stood in it and understood. with the cold and absolute clarity of someone who has finally stopped hoping for a different answer, that the silence was the answer, had always been the answer, and that she had spent 41 years being too frightened to ask the question because she already knew what the silence sounded like. She picked up her bag. "I'm meeting Alexander Blackwood in 2 hours," she said, "and I'm bringing the letter." She walked out of the sitting room and through the hallway and past the photographs and out the front door into the morning, and she did not look back. And she did not cry until she was in the car, and even then it was brief. And even then she kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, because she was her father's daughter, and she was not finished yet. And the man who had built the structure that killed him did not yet know that everything was about to come apart. His name was Victor Whitmore, and he was about to find out that the niece he'd written off as a grieving widow had spent 6 months building the exact mechanism of his destruction, and that this morning, for the first time, she was handing that mechanism to the one man in New York with both the reach and the motive to use it. The building on West 47th Street had no sign because men like Alexander Blackwood did not need signs. Vivian knew this now, the way she knew a number of things she hadn't known 8 months ago. Not from instruction, but from proximity, the slow absorption that happens when you spend enough time near a particular kind of power and let it teach you its grammar. She badged through the lobby with the key card she'd been given at the first meeting and rode the elevator to the 43rd floor and walked down the corridor past 2 men who acknowledged her with the minimal nod of people who knew exactly who she was and had already decided she was permitted. The conference room was the same bare rectangle as before. Alexander was already there, standing at the window with his back to the door, looking at the midtown skyline with the expression of a man who has looked at it so many times it has become a kind of wallpaper, present, unremarkable, simply the visual texture of thought. He turned when she came in. She put the letter on the table without preamble. He read it standing up, which she'd noticed was how he preferred to receive information, on his feet, weight balanced, as if sitting represented a commitment he wasn't ready to make. He read it twice. She watched his face, which gave her approximately nothing except a slight tightening around the jaw at the 3rd paragraph, where her father had written, in the careful language of a man who is trained to understate, "I believe the structures in question were not established by anyone currently within my direct employ, and I intend to pursue the matter with complete discretion before making any formal allegation." Complete discretion. 3 weeks before his heart attack. Alexander set the letter down. "Where did you find this?" "In a box of his personal papers, the ones the estate attorneys returned to the house after probate. I'd been through them twice before, after he died, and then again when I started investigating Ethan. I missed it both times because it was folded inside the carbon copy of a letter to his tailor." She paused. "My father used to hide things inside mundane correspondence. He thought it was funny. He called it the Poe method." Alexander looked at the letter again without picking it up. "The account structure he describes, the layered entities, the offshore holding sequence, it matches what my people found in the Cayman documentation." "I know. Which means Victor built this before Thomas died, potentially years before. Gerald thinks at least 7 years, based on the incorporation dates of the shell entities." Alexander was quiet for a moment. Outside, a helicopter moved across the slice of sky visible through the window, tracking south. He watched it briefly, then looked back at the table. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. The way he said it, not the words, but the half-second of weight before them, the slight repositioning of his shoulders, moved something in Vivian's stomach. "All right," she said. "I reached out to Victor Whitmore 2 days ago." She stared at him. "Before you came to me with any of this," he continued, and his voice was level, deliberate, the voice of a man delivering information he has chosen to deliver in a specific sequence. "Before the letter, I'd identified him as a potential node in the financial network, and I made contact through a mutual business associate in London. Standard approach, nothing that would signal investigation. I wanted to take his temperature before we moved on Ethan." "You contacted Victor," Vivian said, "without telling me." "I was going to tell you at this meeting." "Alexander." She stopped. The words she wanted to say were several different things at once, and none of them were fully formed, and she had learned in the last 6 months that half-formed words spoken under pressure are projectiles that miss their targets. She breathed. What did he say? He didn't say anything. He wasn't available. Alexander paused. Because Victor Whitmore left London 4 days ago. His apartment has been vacated. His London office has been closed. His assistant told my contact that he'd taken an indefinite leave for personal reasons. The room held very still. He ran, Vivian said. He moved, Alexander said with a precision that felt important. We don't know yet where. He knew you were looking. Or he knew something else was coming. He has sources we haven't fully mapped. The network he built over 10 years. It doesn't operate in isolation. Someone in that structure has visibility we don't. He looked at her steadily. Which means someone told him. The implication arrived in the room before either of them said it aloud. Someone who knew that Vivian had been investigating. Someone who had known early enough for Victor to liquidate a London life in 4 days. Someone inside the small circle of people who had been aware of what Vivian was building. How many people knew the full scope? Alexander asked. Not an accusation. An inventory. Gerald, Dana, you. She stopped. Then, because she had to. And I told my mother this morning that I had the letter. That I was bringing it to you. Alexander looked at her. She looked back at him. I told her 2 hours ago, she said. Her voice was flat. 2 hours is enough. She sat down. She hadn't intended to sit, but her legs made the decision without consulting her, and she was in the chair and her hands were on the table and she was staring at the letter, her father's handwriting, the careful, measured sentences of a man who dealt in precision and died before he could use it. And she was thinking about her mother's face that morning. The tightening, the blankness, the absence of an answer to a question about love. My mother called Victor, she said. It wasn't a question. That would be my read, Alexander said. This morning, while I was still in the townhouse, or the moment I left. She pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger, hard enough to feel it. She sat there and said nothing to me, and the minute I walked out, she picked up the phone. Vivian, 68 years old. The words came out with a flatness she recognized as her own version of something she couldn't afford to feel right now. She sat across from me and watched me talk about my father and didn't say a word, and then she called her brother to tell him I was coming. She looked up. Her brother who may have contributed to the conditions that killed her husband. Alexander sat down across from her, which he almost never did. The act of it, the deliberateness, the choice to put himself at the same level, registered in her peripheral awareness as significant. The question, he said, is where Victor went, and whether he took anything with him. My London contact is checking the offshore structures for any movement in the last 72 hours. If he liquidated accounts, we'll see the pattern even if we can't immediately trace the destination. He paused. But if he moved fast enough, he could have restructured the holding sequence before we can freeze it, Vivian said. She knew enough now to understand the mechanics. Gerald had taught her, painstakingly, over 16 evenings in her study with financial diagrams spread across the floor like a map of a country she hadn't known she was living in. If he collapses the Cayman structure and redistributes through new entities, the chain of evidence back to the original transfers breaks. Not completely, but enough to complicate the civil case significantly. And the letter? The letter still establishes intent and foreknowledge, but without the financial trail as corroboration. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Vivian looked at the letter on the table. Her father had written it with a fountain pen, the kind he'd carried in his breast pocket every day of his adult life, a pen she'd given him for his 60th birthday that he'd used until the day he died. She wondered what he'd been thinking when he wrote it, whether he'd been afraid, whether he'd understood even partially what he was sitting on top of. I need to call Dana, she said. Yes. And Gerald needs to know the Cayman documentation may be time-sensitive. Already ahead of it, I have 2 people pulling the account status as of this morning. She nodded and reached for her phone and then stopped, because another thought had arrived. Lateral, unwelcome, with the quality of something that should have occurred to her earlier. Ethan, she said. Alexander waited. If Victor is running, Ethan will know why, or he'll find out soon. Ethan has been in contact with Victor's network. Not directly maybe, but through the legal structures. If someone in that network signals that the architecture is being dismantled, she stopped. Ethan will move too. What does he have access to that we haven't frozen yet? The Meridian account is still active. Dana was going to file Monday. Today is Saturday. We have 36 hours before the banking week opens, and the freeze order can be executed. She looked at Alexander. If Ethan is talking to anyone connected to Victor, and he understands what's happening, he has 36 hours to move whatever is left in Meridian. How much? Gerald estimated approximately 2.1 million as of the last statement we had access to. I can have people at his building within the hour, watching him, making sure he doesn't do anything inconvenient. Vivian's phone was already in her hand. She was dialing Dana when the door to the conference room opened. She had not heard anyone in the corridor. She had not heard the door handle. The door simply opened, with the specific abruptness of something that is not knocking because it has already decided it doesn't need to. And the man who came through it was someone she had never seen before. He was perhaps 60, compact, dressed in the kind of European tailoring that signals old money in a quieter register than American old money does. Silver-haired, with the unhurried bearing of someone for whom urgency is something other people experience. His face was familiar in the way faces are familiar when you've grown up seeing photographs of someone in family albums, and then encounter them in 3 dimensions for the first time. She knew who he was before he spoke. Victor Whitmore said, "Hello, Vivian," in the mild, well-modulated voice of a man paying a routine social call, and then he looked at Alexander with an expression of perfectly calibrated respect, the specific deference of a man who is acknowledging a power structure while simultaneously declining to be governed by it. Vivian's hand tightened around her phone. She had not finished dialing. "Close the door, please," Alexander said. Victor closed it behind him and took the chair at the end of the table without being invited. He looked at the letter, her father's letter, lying on the surface between them, and something in his face acknowledged it without displaying anything that could be called guilt or surprise. It was the look of a man confronting a document he'd been aware of for some time and had been waiting to deal with in the right context. "You didn't run," Vivian said. "I moved some things," Victor said. Standard precaution when one's name begins circulating in conversations it wasn't invited to. He looked at her with the same amber eyes she saw in the mirror every morning, the Whitmore eyes, the family inheritance that had passed through Margaret to both her daughters and to her brother. "But I didn't run. Running is for people who believe the situation is unrecoverable. And you don't believe that." "I believe," Victor said, settling back slightly, "that a great deal of what you think you have is considerably more complicated than your attorney and your forensic accountant have led you to understand. Enlighten me." He looked at her with something that might have been, in a different man, approval. "Thomas, your father, was not the simple victim the letter suggests. The account structures I built were built with his knowledge. Partial knowledge, yes. Managed knowledge, certainly. But he knew there were arrangements in place. He benefited from them initially, before he developed a conscience about the methods involved." He paused. "The letter was written by a man who was revising history in his own favor, preparing a narrative in case things went sideways." The room was very quiet. "You're saying my father was complicit," Vivian said. "I'm saying the picture is not what you've been looking at. My father is dead." "Yes," Victor said. "He is." The word sat in the room, its flatness, its completeness. "Did you have anything to do with that?" Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that, and hated herself slightly for being proud of it at this particular moment. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "His heart gave out. That's what the medical examiner determined. That's what it was." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer that exists." Alexander had not moved or spoken since Victor entered. He was watching the exchange with the attentiveness of a man who is learning something useful and doesn't want to interrupt the process of learning it. Now he said, quietly, "Why are you here, Victor?" Victor turned to him with the careful respect. "Because I have a proposal that benefits everyone at this table, and I'd prefer to make it before your people find everything they're going to find in the next 48 hours, at which point the terms available to me will be significantly less favorable." "You want a deal," Vivian said. "I want to clarify," he said. And then, "Yes, I want a deal." "What clarification?" He reached into his jacket. Slowly, visibly, the deliberate care of a man making sure no one in the room misreads the gesture, and placed a document on the table. It was a single page, and it was in her father's handwriting, and it was dated 6 weeks before the letter she had found. She looked at it. Her father's handwriting, unmistakable, describing in plain terms an agreement between himself and his brother-in-law, Victor Whitmore, regarding the management of certain family assets through a series of offshore structures, in exchange for which Thomas Whitmore would receive preferential returns on a specific portfolio of European investments. It was, in plain language, a contract. Her father had signed it. Vivian stared at the signature, the fountain pen, the same left lean on the capitals, the hard pressure on the downstrokes. She knew that signature the way she knew his voice. She had seen it on birthday cards and legal documents and the letter she'd found hidden inside correspondence to a tailor. She had never seen it on anything like this. "This is fabricated," she said. The words came out automatically, the first defense, the one that arrives before the mind has finished examining the evidence. "I have 3 handwriting analysts," Victor said. "I'll share their reports. You're welcome to commission your own." "Where did this come from?" "It's been in my possession since the day your father and I signed it. I kept a copy. He kept a copy. His copy was presumably in his papers, which reverted to the estate, which was managed in probate by attorneys working at least partially under Ethan's direction. He let that sit. I leave it to you to consider what happened to his copy." Vivian looked at Alexander. Alexander was looking at the document with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not alarm, nothing so reactive as that, but a specific recalibration, the internal adjustment of a man who has received a data point that doesn't fit the model he's been operating with. "If this is genuine," Alexander said, still looking at the document, "it doesn't invalidate the fraud case against Ethan." "No," Victor agreed. "Ethan exceeded his mandate significantly. He was supposed to provide legal insulation for the structures. He used his access to divert funds for his own purposes. That's not something I authorized, and it's not something I'll protect him for." "You'd cooperate against Ethan," Vivian said. "I'd provide full documentation of every unauthorized action Ethan Caldwell took within the structure, which is, frankly, enough to end him professionally and likely criminally." Victor folded his hands on the table. In exchange for recognition that the underlying structure was built with the knowledge and consent of the senior Whitmore. The underlying structure, her father's name, offered as a shield. Vivian sat with that for 3 seconds. She counted them, actually, in some part of her mind that had learned to use time as a pressure valve. Then she said, "You want me to let you use my dead father as a legal buffer? I want us to arrive at an arrangement that reflects the actual complexity of what occurred, rather than a simplified narrative that makes for a cleaner lawsuit." She pushed back from the table. Not standing, just creating distance, the physical instinct to put space between herself and what was on the table. She looked at the ceiling, which was the same bare white as everything else in this room. This deliberately characterless room that had been designed to hold conversations exactly like this one. Her father had signed a contract with Victor. Her father had known, and this was the thing she couldn't yet get around, couldn't yet move through. Her father had been maneuvered into signing something that was presented to him as one thing and was structured as another, by a man who had spent 30 years building the expertise to make those two things look identical, until it was too late to distinguish them. She didn't know which version was true. She couldn't know, not yet, and possibly not ever. And that uncertainty was a specific kind of violence being done to the image she carried of the man who had given her amber earrings on her 30th birthday and taught her the Poe method and died writing letters he intended to use as the foundation of his own defense. "I need an hour," she said. "Of course," Victor said, in the tone of a man who believes the hour will produce the answer he came here for. She stood up and walked to the door and opened it and walked into the corridor and kept walking until she found a bathroom at the end of the hall, and she went inside and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at her own face in the mirror and did not recognize, for a moment, the person she was looking at. The woman in the mirror had her father's eyes and her mother's silence and 6 months of preparation behind her and a document on a conference table that had just made everything she thought she understood feel like scaffolding around a building that hadn't been there. She turned off the water. She dried her hands. She looked at herself until the recognition came back, the slow return of herself to herself, The things she'd had to learn to do in the 6 months of nights when the full scope of the betrayal made sleeping impossible. You do not get to fall apart in the corridor, she told herself. Her father's voice, not hers, the specific cadence he'd used when she was 17, and she'd crashed his car and stood in the driveway shaking, and he'd said, "You do not get to fall apart in the driveway. Come inside. We'll assess the damage, and then we'll decide what we're doing about it. Come inside. Assess the damage." She walked back to the conference room. Victor was still in his chair. Alexander was standing at the window again. She sat down across from Victor Whitmore and looked at the document, at her father's signature, the hard downstrokes, the left-leaning capitals, and said, "I want independent authentication of this document. I want the chain of custody documented. I want Gerald Marsh to examine the financial records that corroborate the agreement you're describing." She looked up. "And I want full disclosure of every structure, every account, every entity in the network. Not the parts you're willing to show me. All of it." Victor considered this. That's a significant ask. "You came here because you believe this table is better than the alternative. I'm telling you the price of this table." She held his gaze, those amber eyes, the Whitmore eyes, the family inheritance she'd never asked for. "Take it, or spend the next 3 years explaining yourself to federal investigators who have considerably less patience than I do." Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he reached back into his jacket and produced a second document, this one thicker, folded twice, and placed it on the table. "I prepared a full disclosure package," he said, "before I came." Vivian looked at the package, then at him. "You were always going to show me this," she said. "I wanted to see how you'd respond to the contract first." "And?" He looked at her with something she had spent 41 years without receiving from any member of her family, and which she recognized with a kind of sick clarity as respect. "You respond the way Thomas did," he said, "when he was at his best." She picked up the disclosure package, and then Alexander spoke from the window, in the voice he used when something had shifted in a way that required immediate attention. "My people just sent me something." Both Vivian and Victor looked at him. He was holding his phone. His expression had not changed dramatically. It never did. But the specific quality of his stillness had altered in the way it altered when he was processing something that required rapid recalculation. "The Meridian account," he said. "There was a transfer this morning, 7:42 a.m. He looked at Vivian. "The account is empty." She stared at him. "Ethan moved it," she said. "Not Ethan." Alexander looked at his phone again. "The transfer authorization carries a secondary signatory we hadn't flagged." He paused. "It was signed by Margaret Whitmore." The silence that entered the room then was a different kind of silence from any that had preceded it, not the silence of shock or grief or the specific muteness of a question without an answer. It was the silence of a structure collapsing, the particular absence of sound that occurs when something that has been load-bearing is no longer there. Vivian's mother had moved the money. This morning. While Vivian was in the townhouse asking her whether she had loved Thomas Whitmore, Margaret Whitmore had been waiting, had already known what she was going to do the moment her daughter walked out the door, had possibly known since the night before, since the ballroom, since some earlier calculation that Vivian still did not have the full dimensions of. She had sat across from her daughter and said nothing and done everything. Victor Whitmore had gone very still in his chair. His expression, for the first time since he'd entered the room, showed something that was not performance, a genuine flicker of something that might have been surprise, or might have been the specific dismay of a man whose own plans have just been altered by a variable he thought he controlled. "Margaret," he said quietly, almost to himself. And the way he said it, the weight of it, the specific texture of a name said by someone who is revising their understanding of a person they believed they knew, told Vivian something she had not expected to learn today. Victor hadn't known. Whatever her mother had done this morning, she had done it without telling her brother. Which meant that Margaret Whitmore was not simply a facilitator in someone else's architecture. She was operating on her own. She always had been. And Vivian understood, in the cold and comprehensive way that understanding sometimes arrives, all at once, with the completeness of a door opening onto a room you didn't know was there, that she had spent 6 months investigating the wrong architect. Vivian was out of her chair before she finished processing the thought. Not running. She didn't run. Her body had learned in 6 months that running was the behavior of someone who hadn't planned. And she had planned everything, except this, except her mother, except the specific way Margaret Whitmore had looked at her across a sitting room this morning, with the absolute stillness of someone who had already acted and was simply waiting for the distance to accumulate, but moving with the compressed urgency of someone who understands that every second she spends in this room is a second the money is traveling further from anything resembling recovery. "Where did it go?" she said to Alexander. Not a question, a demand. "Tracing it now." He had his phone to his ear already, speaking to someone in the low rapid register he used when he needed things done without discussion. He held up one finger. "Wait." And she waited, standing at the table with her hands flat on its surface, and her weight forward and her jaw set so hard she could feel the pressure in her back teeth. Victor Whitmore had not moved from his chair. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man rapidly disassembling everything he thought he knew about a situation and rebuilding it with different load-bearing walls. His disclosure package sat on the table untouched. Whatever leverage he'd believed he carried into this room had just been restructured by his sister in ways he hadn't anticipated, which made him, for the first time since he'd entered, something Vivian could almost use. "The Cayman structure," she said to him. "If Margaret moved the Meridian funds this morning, where would she route them through your network?" He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to incriminate yourself," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me how the plumbing works. You built it. You know where the water goes." A pause. 3 seconds. 4. Then, "There are 2 secondary holding entities that aren't in the documentation I prepared. They were Margaret's. I built them at her request 7 years ago, and she held the authorization credentials independently." He said it with the flat precision of a man who has just decided that loyalty to his sister is less valuable than the arrangement on this table. "They route through a Liechtenstein Foundation to a private account in Singapore. Account numbers. I don't have them memorized." "Then think." He looked at her with those amber eyes, and something moved in them. Not warmth, nothing as simple as that, but recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has spent a long time watching a version of a person they know perform a diminished version of themselves, and is now watching the full version for the first time. He picked up the disclosure package and found a specific page and wrote 4 sequences of numbers on the margin, and pushed it across the table to her. She took it to Alexander. Alexander looked at the numbers and relayed them into his phone without pausing, seamlessly, as if he'd been expecting this extension of the operation, as if his infrastructure had been standing by for exactly this kind of rapid pivot. He said 3 words to whoever was on the other end and hung up and looked at Vivian. "My people have contacts at 2 of the 3 institutions in that chain. We can request a hold, but it's not guaranteed and it's not fast. Singapore especially." He said it without apology, just the clean delivery of operational reality. "We have a better chance if we can get Dana to file an emergency injunction within the next 4 hours. It's Saturday." "Dana knows judges." Vivian was already dialing. Dana picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake and watching, which meant she was the professional Vivian had paid her to be. Vivian delivered the information in 30 seconds. The transfer, the time, the routing sequence, the Liechtenstein Foundation, the Singapore terminal account, and Dana said nothing until she finished and then said, "I need the account numbers. Sending them now. And I need to know if Margaret Whitmore has signatory authority on any domestic accounts that haven't already been flagged. I'll get Gerald on it." "Vivian," Dana's voice dropped half a register. "If Margaret executed this transfer this morning with full knowledge of what you were doing, if she was in that townhouse talking to you while she had an active instruction in place to move the funds the moment you left," she stopped. "That's not just fraud. That's witness intimidation adjacent. That's someone who understood the legal exposure and moved assets specifically to defeat a pending civil action. I know what it is. I want you to hear me say it out loud because I need you to understand that this changes the criminal exposure significantly. For her. I understand. Your mother, Vivian. Dana. Her voice was flat and final. File the injunction. She hung up. The room was thick with the specific energy of a situation that has been planned for months suddenly accelerating past the plan's parameters, demanding improvisation from people who had prepared for precision, and the gap between those two things was where things broke. She knew that. She had known since the night of the ballroom that the plan was a framework, not a guarantee, and that the people she was moving against were not passive targets, but operators in their own right who would adapt and countermove. And she had tried to account for that, had tried to build redundancy into every layer of what she'd constructed. And she had not accounted for her mother. She had not accounted for her mother because some part of her, some irrational, persistent, deeply human part that had survived 41 years without being fully educated out of its illusions, had not believed Margaret would move against her own daughter with this degree of cold operational precision. She believed it now. "I need a car," she said to Alexander. He read her face. "Where are you going?" "Where do you think?" "Vivian." He said her name the way he sometimes said it when he was deciding whether to push back. Weighted, deliberate. Going to the townhouse right now is reactive. Reactive is how people make mistakes that cost them the endgame. "She's going to run," Vivian said. "If she moved the money this morning and she knows I was just here with you, she knows the next step. She'll be on a flight by tonight. My people can watch the townhouse." "Your people watching the townhouse doesn't help me. I need her in a room." She picked up her bag. "I need her to look at me." Alexander looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Victor. Victor said without being asked, "She won't respond to me. We haven't spoken directly in 6 weeks. A pause. "She doesn't take instruction from me. She never did, really. I built the structure. She used it." Vivian walked to the door. "Take someone with you," Alexander said behind her. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "Send one of your people. Plain clothes. I don't want her to see anyone coming." "Already moving," he said. She went. The town car moved through Saturday morning Manhattan with the particular freedom that the city grants on weekend mornings before noon, lighter traffic, longer greens, the streets belonging briefly to deliveries and joggers, and the occasional cab rather than the solid wall of weekday commerce. Vivian sat in the back and looked at her phone, and did not look at her phone and looked out the window and breathed. Gerald called at 9:47. He'd found 2 additional domestic accounts bearing Margaret's name as signatory, one a joint account with the estate that had been flagged but not yet frozen, one a personal account at a private bank on Park Avenue that hadn't appeared in any of the documentation because it predated the financial structures Gerald had been examining and had simply not been on the map they were working from. Both were empty as of this morning. She asked Gerald to document everything and send it to Dana and hang up. She called Charlotte. 3 rings, 4. Then, "Vivian." Charlotte's voice had the texture of someone who had not slept. Vivian recognized it because she'd been living in that texture for 6 months. "Where are you?" Vivian said. "My apartment." A pause. "I've been watching my phone all night. The footage from the ballroom is everywhere." "I know." "Ethan hasn't called me." Charlotte's voice cracked slightly on the name and then recovered, the vocal equivalent of a stumble caught before the fall. "I've called him 3 times. "Charlotte, I need you to listen to me." "What happened to the money?" Vivian stopped. "What do you know about the money?" "I got a call this morning, early, before 7. It was Mom." A sound that might have been a short, involuntary laugh. "She called to tell me she'd taken steps to protect the family assets. That's what she called it. Protect. She told me not to contact you and not to speak to any attorneys and that everything would be handled. She called you. To warn me, I think, or to warn herself. I don't—" Charlotte stopped. When she started again, her voice was lower and rougher than Vivian had ever heard it. "Vivian, what is happening with Mom?" "I'm going to the townhouse." "I'm coming." "Charlotte, I'm coming." The voice that said it was not the voice of the woman who had stood in a ballroom last night flushed and performing anger because fear was less comfortable. It was flatter than that, simpler. The voice of someone who has spent the night sitting with a specific revelation and has arrived at the far side of it and found something harder there than grief. "She called me at 6:50 in the morning and told me not to talk to my sister. I'm coming." Vivian looked out the window. They were crossing 72nd Street. 15 minutes, she said. The townhouse looked the way it always looked on a Saturday morning. The window boxes her mother maintained with the same iron consistency she applied to everything. The brass knocker centered exactly, the front steps swept. The ordinary face of a life managed into perfect surface. Vivian got out of the car and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at it. The man Alexander had sent was already there, across the street, reading a newspaper with the practiced invisibility of someone who did this professionally. He didn't acknowledge her. She didn't acknowledge him. She went up the steps and used her key, the one she'd had since her father gave it to her at 18, the one she'd kept in her wallet through 5 years of marriage to a man who'd wanted her to return it because he thought it was a boundary issue, which she had not done, which was one of the small, quiet refusals that had told her something true about herself, even when she was too submerged in the marriage to see it clearly. The hallway was dim. The housekeeper wasn't visible. "Mom?" Her voice moved through the house and came back without carrying anything. She walked through the hallway into the sitting room, empty, into the dining room, empty, through to the kitchen where the coffee maker had been used. There was a half-full cup on the counter, still faintly warm when she put her hand near it. But no one was there. She went upstairs. Her mother's bedroom door was open. Margaret Whitmore was standing at the window with her back to the door, dressed in a charcoal traveling suit, a single suitcase open on the bed behind her. It was half-packed. Not chaotically, neatly, with the organization of a woman who, even in departure, refused to be slovenly. Folded garments, a jewelry roll, a document envelope. Vivian looked at the document envelope. "Don't," Margaret said, without turning around. "Don't what?" "Don't pick up the envelope. It's personal correspondence." "Mom?" Vivian walked into the room and stopped 4 feet from her mother's back. "Turn around." Margaret turned around. She looked, Vivian thought, exactly like herself. That was the thing. There was no visible alteration, no haggardness, no guilt made physical, no outward evidence that she was a woman who had emptied family accounts at 7 in the morning while her daughter sat in her sitting room asking whether she'd ever loved her husband. She looked exactly like Margaret Whitmore, immaculate, contained, the product of decades of practice. Only the eyes. The eyes were doing something that Margaret hadn't finished controlling yet, something with the lower lids, a slight involuntary tension, the body's irreducible honesty. "Sit down," Vivian said. "I was just going to—" "Sit down, Mom." Margaret sat. She chose the chair by the window, the one she always chose, the one that faced the door, which was the choice of a woman who preferred to see what was coming. She folded her hands in her lap. The gesture was so familiar, the specific placement, the deliberate stillness, that it moved something in Vivian's chest that she didn't have time to examine. "The Meridian account," Vivian said. "The Meridian account," Margaret said, "contained assets that originated in part from your grandfather's estate, which predated your father's ownership, and which I had independent claim to under the terms of—" "Stop!" Vivian's voice came out sharper than she'd planned. "Stop doing that. Stop talking like a deposition." Margaret stopped. "You moved $2.1 million this morning while I was sitting downstairs." "Yes." The plainness of it, the simple, undefended yes, hit harder than a constructed explanation would have. There was a kind of violence in that directness, a refusal to pretend. "And you called Victor before I left." A pause, shorter than it should have been for a denial to be credible. "I notified him that you were aware of certain matters. You warned him. I informed him. He ran. He took precautions." Vivian looked at her mother, 68 years old, sitting in her chair by the window with her hands folded and her spine straight, and the thing that was happening in her lower lids was more visible now. The effort of control against something that wanted, on some physical level, not to be controlled. "Why?" Vivian said. Margaret looked back at her without speaking. "Not the money. Not the strategy. I understand the mechanics." She moved closer. Not threatening. Simply removing the distance that allowed Margaret to treat this as a conversation between positions rather than between people. "Why did you do this to us? To the family, to Dad?" "Your father," Margaret said, and then stopped. "Finish it." "Your father built something," Margaret said, "that he was very proud of. and he built it with a great deal of help that he eventually decided he didn't want to acknowledge. And when he decided he was going to rewrite the history of how the Whitmore estate came to be what it is, he was going to do it in a way that would have destroyed Victor and destroyed me and left himself standing on ground that I helped pour. Her voice was even, controlled, but it had a frequency underneath it, a low vibration that Vivian had never heard in it before. I did not destroy your father, but I was not going to allow him to destroy me. He had a heart attack. Yes. You said that like it's obvious. It is obvious. He had a heart attack. He had high blood pressure for 8 years, and he drank more than his doctors knew, and he was under significant stress. Margaret looked at her daughter with the amber eyes they shared. His heart gave out. That is what happened. And the conversation you had with him 3 weeks before. A pause. We had several conversations. About the accounts, about Victor. We had a disagreement about the appropriate way to handle certain arrangements that had served the family for years and that Thomas had decided were inconvenient now that his conscience had developed opinions. Did you threaten him? The question landed in the room with its full weight. Margaret's jaw tightened, the lower lids, the hands in her lap, tightening very slightly against each other, the knuckles changing color. I told him, she said carefully, that if he pursued a course of action designed to expose Victor's involvement in the estate structures, he would expose his own involvement as well. I told him that the story he was planning to tell was not the whole story. She paused. That is not a threat. That is a fact. You told a man with high blood pressure, who was under significant stress, that the thing he was planning to do would destroy him publicly 3 weeks before he died. I told him the truth. Mom. Vivian's voice broke on the word. Not with grief, or not only with grief, but with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has just been told the thing is heavier than they knew. Do you hear yourself? I hear myself perfectly. The front door opened downstairs. Both of them looked toward the bedroom door. Footsteps on the stairs. 2 sets, moving with purpose. Charlotte appeared in the doorway first, still in the clothes she'd apparently been wearing all night. Dark circles under those amber eyes, her hair loose and uncombed. Behind her, moving into the room with the unhurried authority of someone who has been to this kind of room before, was Alexander Blackwood. Vivian hadn't called him here. She looked at him. Dana filed the injunction 20 minutes ago, he said quietly. Emergency basis. The Singapore account is under a provisional hold pending international coordination. It's not guaranteed, but it buys time. He looked at Margaret. The Liechtenstein Foundation has been notified through our legal contacts. Victor's secondary entities are flagged. He said it all in the same conversational register, like a man delivering a weather report. You're not going anywhere today, Mrs. Whitmore. Margaret looked at Alexander Blackwood with an expression Vivian hadn't expected. Not fear, nothing that surface level, but a very deep and very old recognition. The look of a woman who has known that this specific reckoning has been approaching for some time and has simply been engaged in the project of postponing it. You look like your father, Margaret said to Vivian. Not to Alexander, to Vivian. Out of nowhere, into the charged air of the room, with a quality that was neither apology nor concession, but something rawer than either. When you're angry, you look exactly like him. No one said anything. Charlotte made a sound from the doorway that was very small and very compressed, the sound of someone holding something in that is too large for the space available. Vivian looked at the suitcase on the bed, the half-packed garments, the jewelry roll, the document envelope she hadn't picked up. She walked to the bed and picked up the document envelope. Don't, Margaret said. Vivian opened it. Inside were 3 items: a photograph, a legal document, and a handwritten note. The photograph was of Margaret and Thomas Whitmore, taken sometime in the early years of their marriage, standing somewhere coastal with the wind in their hair, and Margaret's hand on Thomas's arm, and both of them squinting into the sun with the unself-conscious ease of people who believed they had a great deal of time. The legal document was a will amendment, dated 6 years ago, signed by Thomas Whitmore. It removed Margaret as executor of the estate and named an independent trustee. He had known. He had been protecting himself and protecting Vivian. And Margaret had known he'd done it, and the amendment had never been filed because Thomas had died before he acted on it, and Margaret had found it, or always known about it, and kept it, and the keeping of it was either a crime or an act of grief or both, and the distinction no longer mattered because it was in Vivian's hands now. She looked at the note last. It was in her father's handwriting. It said, "Viv, if you're reading this without me, look at what's around it. Love, Dad." Charlotte said from the doorway. "What is it?" Vivian's throat had closed. She cleared it. "He left me something." Her voice was barely functional. "He hid it in Mom's things because he knew I'd eventually go through them." The room was very still. Alexander had moved to stand near the window, giving her the space to be whatever she needed to be in this moment, which was a thing she recognized as a form of respect more meaningful than most of what people called respect. Charlotte came into the room fully and stood beside Vivian and looked at the photograph. Their parents, young and coastal and unsuspecting. And something in her sister's face went through several things at once. The compressed, rapid processing of someone whose model of the past is being revised in real time. Margaret had not moved. She was looking at the photograph in Vivian's hand with an expression that was finally beyond control. The lower lids had lost the battle. Her eyes were bright, and her hands in her lap were gripping each other, and the spine that had been straight for 68 years was still straight but barely, the way a structure stays upright through force of habit after the supports have been removed. "He kept that photograph," Margaret said. "It came out very quietly. On his desk. For 40 years. Vivian looked at her mother. "Did you love him?" she said. The same question as the morning before. The same quiet voice. The same desperate smallness of it. Margaret looked at the photograph, and this time her mouth opened. But before the words came, Alexander's phone produced a single sharp vibration, and he looked at it, and his expression did the thing it did when something had happened that required immediate management. And he said, "Ethan's left his building. He has a car. My people are behind him, but he has a head start." "Where is he going?" Vivian said. "Based on direction. The airport." Charlotte turned from the photograph to Vivian. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry now, dried past the point of tears into something denser and more durable. "Go," Charlotte said. "Charlotte, I'll stay with her." She looked at Margaret, their mother, sitting in her chair by the window with her hands in her lap and her eyes bright, and the photograph somewhere in the space between them. "Go get him." Vivian looked at her sister, then at her mother, then at Alexander. "Car," she said. They moved. Tip. The Lincoln Tunnel backed up on Saturdays, and Alexander's driver took the Midtown Tunnel instead, cutting east and then south, with the aggressive efficiency of someone who understood that traffic was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted. Vivian was on the phone to Dana for 4 of the 12 minutes it took to reach the FDR, and on the phone to Gerald for 3 more, and in the remaining time she sat with her hand pressed flat against her sternum in the unconscious gesture she'd developed in the last 6 months, for moments when her heart rate needed managing. JFK was 22 minutes from the tunnel exit on a Saturday morning with no complications. Ethan had a 20-minute head start. "Which terminal?" she said. Alexander was on his own phone. He held up a hand, getting it, and then said a single word to whoever was on the line and hung up. "International, Terminal 4. He has a ticket for the 7:45 to Zurich." "Is it boarding?" "In 18 minutes. She looked out the window. The FDR ran alongside the river, and the river was flat and gray, and the city across it was bright in the morning light, and none of it mattered. "Can you stop him boarding?" "Not without a legal instrument." He looked at her. "Dana's injunction covers assets, not persons. He's not under arrest. He hasn't been charged. He can get on a plane." "He cannot get on a plane," she said. "Then we need to give him a reason to stop." She thought. She thought the way she'd learned to think in 6 months of this, not linearly, not in the sequence of logic, but laterally, finding the adjacent truth that changes the shape of the primary problem. What would stop Ethan Caldwell from boarding a flight to Zurich? Not law enforcement, not an injunction. Not anything procedural in the next 18 minutes. What would stop him? The answer arrived. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had memorized 6 weeks ago and never used. It rang twice. "This is Garrison Pierce," said the voice on the other end with the cautious alertness of a man who doesn't recognize the number. "This is Vivian Caldwell," she said. "I have something you need to hear before the market opens Monday and before Ethan Caldwell lands in Zurich. And you have about 30 seconds to decide whether you want to hear it." A pause. Brief. Then, "I'm listening." She told him 3 things: the Meridian transfers, the forged signature on the June authorization, and the name of the offshore entity through which Ethan had been diverting funds from Garrison Pierce's own investment portfolio without Garrison Pierce's knowledge. That last one she had found 4 days ago, the same night as the letter, in the same box, in a document she had initially set aside as administrative and then picked up again at 3 in the morning with the instinct of someone who has learned to look at the thing that seems least important. When she finished, the silence on the other end had a different quality from the silence at the beginning of the call. "How long?" Garrison Pierce said. "Gerald estimates 18 months. Another silence, then, "I'll make a call." He hung up. Alexander was watching her. "Garrison Pierce has 4 people on Ethan's board," she said. "He has a personal relationship with the chairman of Ethan's primary lending institution, and Ethan has been stealing from him for 18 months. She looked out the window. The exit for the Van Wyck was coming up. Garrison Pierce is going to make a phone call, and Ethan is going to receive some information, and Ethan is going to realize that the thing waiting for him in Zurich no longer exists. Alexander looked at her for a moment. "Your father," he said, "would have done that." She didn't answer. She watched the exit ramp and pressed her hand flat against her chest and counted her own heartbeats, which were elevated but steady, which was all she could ask. The car took the exit. They were 12 minutes out. Her phone rang. The number was one she didn't recognize, and she answered it, and the voice on the other end was Ethan's. Clipped, stripped of the social polish she'd listened to for 5 years, carrying the particular register of a man who has just learned that the destination he was running toward has collapsed. "What did you tell Garrison?" he said. "The truth," she said. "Vivian." His voice cracked on the second syllable, just slightly, the way things crack when the pressure inside exceeds what the surface can hold. "We can work this out. Come to the terminal. We can talk." "We're already on our way," she said. She hung up. She looked out the window at the approach to JFK, the long, flat approach roads, the signs for terminals, the ordinary machinery of departure, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months, which was the specific physical sensation of a situation that has been contracting for a very long time beginning, finally, to move in the other direction. Not relief, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the beginning of an ending. The car pulled up to Terminal 4 and Vivian opened the door before it fully stopped and stepped out into the cold morning air with Alexander at her shoulder, and the sliding glass doors ahead of them opened automatically, and inside she could already see, at the far end of the departures hall, a tall man in a charcoal coat standing very still beside a luggage cart with the expression of someone who has run out of runway and knows it, and who is now waiting to see what comes through the door. She walked toward him. Ethan Caldwell looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing she noticed walking toward him across the departures hall. Not his expression, not the luggage cart beside him, not the posture of a man who had run out of options and was now standing in the architecture of his own collapse. Just the smallness of him. The way the space around him seemed suddenly indifferent to his presence, the way the hall continued its ordinary Saturday morning operations. Rolling suitcases, intercom announcements, a child crying somewhere near the check-in counters, without organizing itself around him the way rooms had always organized themselves around Ethan Caldwell when he believed they should. He watched her come. His hands were at his sides. The charcoal coat was the same one from the night before, which meant he hadn't been home, which meant he'd been somewhere in the city since leaving the Hargrove, and had made his decision about Zurich in the hours between then and 7 in the morning, possibly in the same window when his mother-in-law was executing wire transfers and his brother-in-law was boarding a flight he couldn't finish, and the entire structure he'd inserted himself into was beginning its terminal contraction. She stopped 8 feet from him. Alexander stopped 2 paces behind her left shoulder and stayed there. Ethan looked at Alexander. then back at Vivian. The calculation she'd watched him perform his whole life, the rapid triage of a room, the instant assessment of power and leverage and who holds what, moved visibly across his face, and the result of the calculation was something she'd never seen there before. Not defeat exactly, something more specific. The particular expression of a man who has just understood that every exit he mapped has been closed, not by force, but by the simple, patient accumulation of consequences he chose not to believe would materialize. "I'm not running," he said, as if she'd accused him of it. "You have a ticket to Zurich." "I have a business contact in Zurich." "Ethan." Her voice was quiet. Not gentle. She wasn't feeling gentle, but quiet. The way you're quiet when you don't need volume to carry weight. "Garrison Pierce made his call. Whatever you thought was waiting for you, there isn't any more." His jaw tightened. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, the same thing I've been collecting for 6 months. The Meridian transfers were legitimate business. You forged my signature." He stopped. "June 11th, she said. "I was in London. You knew I was in London. You authorized a transfer of $900,000 using a signature that a forensic document examiner has already confirmed was not produced by my hand." She let that sit. "That's not a business structure, Ethan. That's not a complicated legal arrangement or a financial instrument I don't understand. That's a forged signature on a transfer document, which is wire fraud, which is federal." He looked at the floor, then at the departures board above them, which was listing a 7:45 to Zurich that would leave without him, then back at her. "What do you want?" he said. "I want you to sit down." There was a row of seats 20 feet to the left. He looked at them, and then at her, and then he walked to them and sat, and she sat across from him, and Alexander remained standing at the appropriate distance, present, unignorable, but giving the conversation its space. Ethan put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for approximately 4 seconds. Then he sat back up. His eyes were dry. She had half expected they wouldn't be, had half prepared herself for the discomfort of watching a man she'd spent 5 years with cry in an airport departures hall. But his eyes were dry, and his expression when it reemerged from his hands was not grief, but exhaustion. The specific, total exhaustion of someone who has been performing a version of themselves for so long that the performance and the person have become indistinguishable, and the audience has finally stopped believing it, and there is nothing left to perform for. "The June transfer," he said. "The signature." He exhaled through his nose. "I need to know what you're filing and when." "Dana filed an emergency injunction this morning. The civil action against you will be filed Monday. Gerald has documented the full scope of the unauthorized transfers from the joint accounts, the Meridian funds, and the Cayman structure." She paused. "Victor Whitmore has agreed to cooperate and provide documentation of every action you took within the network that exceeded your authorized role." Something shifted in his expression at Victor's name. "Victor's cooperating." He made a calculation about where his interests lie. She watched Ethan process this, watched the specific reorganization that happens when a person discovers that the network they believed would hold them has already begun releasing its grip. "He's not your ally, Ethan. He was never your ally. You were useful to him." "And what is he to you?" "A problem I'm managing separately." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The hall moved around them, the announcements, the luggage, the ordinary human traffic of departure and arrival. And in the middle of it, they sat across from each other like the last 2 people in a room that used to hold a marriage. "I should have—" He started and stopped. He tried again. "I knew what I was doing, with Charlotte, with the accounts." His voice was not confessional. There was no warmth in it, no reaching for absolution. It was the voice of a man doing an inventory. "I told myself the accounts were recoverable, that I'd put the money back before it became an issue." He paused. "And Charlotte, I told myself that was separate." "Was it?" He looked at the floor. "No." "Did you love her?" He didn't answer immediately. When he did, the answer was brief and honest in a way that cost him something. "I don't think I'm built for it. Love." He said the word the way people say words they've used for years without being sure they know what they mean. "I think I recognize it as a resource, I think I've always done that. Vivian looked at him. 5 years. She had sat across this man at dinner tables and in bed and in cars and in the rooms of other people's houses, and she had tried at various points to believe something different about what he was. And every time the evidence had corrected her and she had chosen not to look at the evidence, and the choice had cost her 6 months of her life and $4.3 million, and the particular damage that comes from being betrayed by someone you'd already chosen to forgive in advance. Sign the agreement, she said. Full cooperation with the civil action, surrender of the Cayman documentation, acknowledgement of the unauthorized transfers. She reached into her bag and produced the document Dana had prepared 2 days ago against the possibility of exactly this conversation. No criminal referral from our side on the forgery charge, in exchange for complete cooperation and full financial restitution within 18 months. He looked at the document. That's... He was reading. His eyes moved down the page. That's everything. Yes. My firm will not survive this regardless. You know that. She said it without cruelty, which was harder than saying it with cruelty would have been. Garrison Pierce is already talking to the board. Your lending relationships are compromised. The Zurich contact, whoever it was, is not available to you anymore. She paused. What this agreement does is give you something to walk away from rather than something to be taken from you in court over the next 3 years. He read the document again. He turned to the second page. His lips moved slightly on one of the clauses. Unconscious, the reflex of someone reading carefully, and she recognized the gesture from the nights he'd reviewed contracts at the kitchen table, and she'd brought him coffee and believed, in the ordinary domestic way of someone who wasn't looking at the evidence, that they were building something together. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a pen. He signed it. He handed it back without looking at her, the way you hand something back when you can't watch the transaction complete. She took it and put it in her bag. Is there anything else? He said. No. He stood up. He picked up the handle of the luggage cart. He looked at the departures board one more time. The 7:45 to Zurich, now reading final boarding, now reading gate closed. And then he looked at Vivian Whitmore, which was her name, the one she'd carried for 41 years before she'd temporarily lent it to a man who'd treated it as a line of credit. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say that would have made it better or made it worse, and they both knew it, and so he turned and walked toward the exit, and the sliding doors opened for him, and the cold air came in briefly, and then the doors closed, and he was gone. Vivian sat in the plastic airport seat and breathed. Alexander came and sat beside her. Not across. Beside. He didn't say anything either. He sat with his forearms on his knees and looked at the middle distance and let her have the silence she needed, which was exactly the right thing to do, and which she absorbed without comment. After a while, she said, I need to go back to the townhouse. I know, he said. Charlotte is there. I know. She stood up. She straightened her coat. She picked up her bag. She looked at the space where Ethan had been standing when she walked in, and it was just a section of departure's hall floor now, unremarkable, already being crossed by a family with a stroller and 2 rolling suitcases. She walked out. The townhouse was quieter than she'd left it. The man Alexander had posted across the street was gone. She noted this without asking, understanding that his continued presence was no longer necessary. Charlotte's voice was audible from the sitting room before Vivian reached the door, low and continuous. Not the voice of an argument, but the voice of someone talking without expectation of response, which was a thing Vivian associated with a very particular kind of emotional state. She stood in the doorway. Charlotte was sitting on the small ottoman near the window, leaning slightly forward, her hands loose between her knees. Margaret was in her chair, the chair by the window, the one she always chose, and her hands were no longer folded in her lap. They were in her lap, open, palms up, fingers slightly curled, the posture of someone who has stopped performing composure because there is no one left to perform it for. Charlotte looked up when Vivian appeared. Her eyes were red but dry, and her expression carried the specific flatness of someone who has cried everything available and is now on the other side of it, in the terrain that exists past tears, where everything is simply very clear and very heavy. She talked, Charlotte said. Not triumphant, not relieved. Just reporting. Vivian looked at Margaret. Margaret was looking at her own open hands. She looked up when Vivian entered fully, and the expression on her face was something Vivian had not prepared for. Not the controlled assessment of the sitting room this morning, not the careful blankness of the ballroom, not any of the faces she'd filed under Margaret across 41 years. This was older than any of those, more elemental. "Sit down, Vivian," Margaret said, and the way she said it, the same words she'd used this morning, but with a completely different gravitational pull, the weight of a woman who is not issuing direction but asking something, made Vivian walk across the room and sit on the sofa and put her bag on the floor. They were three women in a sitting room that had been the site of 40 years of a particular kind of family life, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that caught the dust motes in the air, and the photograph that was still on the bed upstairs, and the history that was in the walls, whether any of them wanted it or not. "I married your father," Margaret said, "because he was the first person who ever looked at me like I was worth looking at for longer than the duration of a social event." She said it flatly, without romance, the way people state facts they've examined so many times the feeling has been worn smooth. "My family was not— Victor was not the person you met today. Victor, when I was young, was a different kind of pressure. The kind that tells you what you're worth by telling you what you're for." She paused. Thomas looked at me and saw something I didn't see in myself. And I loved him for it, genuinely. Whatever you think about what happened later. Charlotte was very still on the ottoman. Vivian said nothing. When the money started to become a problem, when Victor came to me, years into the marriage, with the arrangement, I told myself it was protection. That the structures he was building would protect what Thomas had built. That I was doing something pragmatic that Thomas would have done himself if he hadn't had the luxury of keeping his hands clean. She looked at her open palms. Thomas kept his hands clean by not asking where the returns came from. "I kept the books. I knew what I was doing." A pause. "I knew exactly what I was doing. And when he found out," Vivian said, "when he found out he wanted to be the wronged party. He wanted to write a letter to his attorney and commission an audit and stand in front of his peers and be the man who uncovered an injustice." Her voice had an edge now, not cruelty, but something old and serrated. He didn't want to be the man who'd benefited from the arrangement for 11 years and asked no questions. And I was not willing to stand beside him while he performed that version of our life. "So you told him it would destroy him too?" "I told him the truth." "Mom," Charlotte's voice from the ottoman, quiet, "did you know he was going to die?" The question was not what Vivian had expected, and from Margaret's expression it was not what she had expected either. The room held it. "No," Margaret said. The word came out different from the others, less processed, less worn smooth, raw at the edges. "I did not know he was going to die. I said what I said, and he was angry, and we did not speak again in the way that people speak when they intend to find their way back to each other. And then 3 weeks later, Elena called me from the study." She stopped. "And I have not had a single night since then where I didn't lie awake and understand exactly what the last conversation I had with my husband was." The dust motes moved in the afternoon light. "That is not the same as killing him," Margaret said. "I am asking you to hold those two things separately. What I did and what happened." Vivian looked at her mother. She looked at the photograph on the mantel, a different one from the coastal photograph upstairs, this one a formal portrait from some event decades ago, Thomas and Margaret standing side by side with the particular careful proximity of people who have built something together and are not entirely sure anymore what to do with their hands. She looked at Charlotte on the ottoman, Charlotte who had spent years seeking something from a man who treated love as inventory, and had ended up here, in this room, with her makeup from last night still faintly present under her eyes, and her hair uncombed and her hands loose between her knees. She thought about what it cost to hold two things separately, what it cost to say, "This is true, and this other thing is also true. And both of them live in the same house, and you don't get to choose which one answers the door." She picked up the will amendment from where she'd placed it on the coffee table. Thomas Whitmore's amendment, dated 6 years ago, removing Margaret as executor. She looked at it. She had been carrying it since the townhouse bedroom, and she had not yet decided what to do with it, and she understood that what she did with it would say something about what kind of person she was on the other side of this, which was a question she was only beginning to be able to ask. She placed it on the table facing Margaret. Margaret looked at it. She had known about it, had kept it, had hidden it, had made a calculation about it that she hadn't shared with Victor or Ethan or anyone, had carried it alone for 6 years. The sight of it in the open produced something in her face that was the furthest thing from relief. "This belongs with the estate attorneys," Vivian said. "It should have gone to them the day after he died. It didn't. That's obstruction, and you know it, and Dana Kress knows it, and we're not going to pretend otherwise." She looked at her mother. "But I'm not going to use it as a weapon. It goes to the attorneys, the estate is restructured according to his intent, and what happens legally from there is between you and Dana and whatever agreement we arrive at." "Vivian, I'm not finished," she breathed. "Victor provides full disclosure and cooperates with the financial investigation. The Singapore account, the Liechtenstein Foundation, the secondary entities, all of it. Dana will work with his attorneys on a structure that reflects the actual complexity of what was built and who built it and who knew what." She paused. "Which means Dad's name will be part of that accounting. His involvement, his knowledge, whatever it was, accurate and documented." She let that land. "I'm not protecting a myth. He was a complicated man who made some choices I don't fully understand, and who also loved me and hid a note in a document envelope in a place he knew I'd eventually look. Both of those things are true." Margaret's eyes were bright again. She wasn't fighting it this time. "What do you want from me?" Margaret said. Vivian thought about it. Really thought. Not the prepared answer, not the strategic position. What she actually wanted from the woman sitting across from her, who had Margaret's hands and Margaret's spine and the amber eyes they all shared and 68 years of choices that had brought them to this afternoon and this room. "I want you to stop," she said. "All of it. The management, the architecture, the performing of a version of this family that serves whatever you need it to serve." She leaned forward slightly. "I want you to be accountable for what you did without making it into a narrative about what you had to do. I want you to sit with Charlotte and answer whatever she asks you honestly for as long as she needs to ask it." She paused. "And I want you to understand that what I'm offering you right now, the space to do those things instead of a criminal referral, is not forgiveness. I don't have that available yet. I don't know if I ever will. But it's what I can give you today, and it's considerably more than you gave me this morning when you were sitting in my house emptying the accounts while I asked you about my father." Margaret looked at her, then at Charlotte, then at her open hands. She closed them. Not a fist, just closed, ordinary, the hands of a woman deciding to hold something instead of letting it rest. "All right," she said. It was the smallest thing she'd said in 41 years of conversation, and it was somehow the most. Boss. Victor Whitmore returned to New York 3 days later and met with Dana Kress and his own attorneys for 11 hours in a conference room on Lexington Avenue. Vivian was not present. She had her full disclosure package delivered and her conditions documented, and she let Dana do the work that Dana was extraordinarily well qualified to do, and she spent those 11 hours in her own apartment, the one she'd moved into 6 weeks ago when she finally vacated the house she'd shared with Ethan, the apartment on the park that she'd leased in her name alone for the first time in her adult life. Sitting at the table by the window with the estate documents spread before her, and her father's letter in her hand in the specific quiet of someone who has been in motion for 6 months and is only now, tentatively, beginning to be still. The civil action against Ethan Caldwell proceeded. He cooperated fully, which was the agreement, and full cooperation meant that the picture assembled by Gerald Marsh over the following weeks was comprehensive and documented and immune to the kind of procedural disruption that extended litigation usually provided. Ethan's firm did not survive the first month. The board removed him before the civil judgment was entered. He was not criminally charged, which was the agreement, and the absence of criminal charges did not prevent his name from becoming, in the specific ecosystem of New York financial society, an index of a particular kind of failure, not spectacular, not newsworthy, but total. The kind of failure that other men in boardrooms reference quietly to each other as a lesson about the distance between what you take and what you actually own. Charlotte moved out of her apartment in April and took a smaller place in Brooklyn that she'd found herself through a rental listing without telling anyone until she'd already signed the lease. She called Vivian to tell her the address and said, I needed to pick something that nobody else had an opinion about. And Vivian said, I know. And that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. They had other conversations over the following weeks, longer ones, harder ones, the kind that go in circles before they find the through line. And Charlotte asked questions about the ballroom and about the letter and about what Vivian had known and when. And Vivian answered them honestly, including the parts that were unflattering to herself, because honesty without the unflattering parts was just a different kind of performance. Charlotte also talked to Margaret. Vivian didn't ask about those conversations, and Charlotte didn't report them in detail, and the privacy of that particular reckoning between a mother and a younger daughter felt like something that needed its own air. What Vivian knew was that Charlotte started painting again. She'd stopped in her late 20s for reasons she'd described at the time as practical, and Vivian now understood as more complicated. And in the Brooklyn apartment, she set up a corner of the living room with a work table and cheap canvas boards and tubes of paint, whose smell, Charlotte said, made the apartment feel like somewhere she actually lived. That was what Charlotte said. Somewhere she actually lived. Vivian turned it over for days. Net. The estate restructuring took 4 months and involved attorneys and accountants and 2 court appearances and a conference call with a judge in the Cayman Islands that Gerald described afterward as the most expensive telephone call of his professional life. At the end of it, the Whitmore estate, Thomas Whitmore's estate, built across 30 years through a combination of genuine acuity and arrangements that existed in the complicated territory between strategy and complicity, was restructured according to the will amendment he'd prepared 6 years before his death. It was not everything Vivian had imagined reclaiming. The secondary structures had been partially liquidated in the days before the Singapore freeze took effect, and the recovery on those funds was incomplete. And the honest accounting of what her father had known and agreed to meant that some of what she'd been thinking of as pure inheritance was more complicated than that in its origins. She sat with Gerald one afternoon in early May and looked at the final numbers and felt something that was not quite what she'd expected to feel. Not triumph, not satisfaction in the clean, completed sense. Something more like the feeling at the end of a very long road when you've arrived at the destination, and the destination is real, but it is also just a place, subject to weather and time, like everywhere else. It's enough, Gerald said, which was an accountant's version of comfort, and which she actually found comforting. It's enough, she agreed. Margaret Whitmore did not go to prison. The agreement Dana constructed with her attorneys involved full financial cooperation, a formal acknowledgement of the withheld will amendment, and a structured repayment arrangement against the estate that would take several years and require a significantly reduced version of Margaret's existing life. The townhouse was sold in June. Margaret moved to a smaller apartment on the west side that she furnished with pieces from the townhouse that the estate agreement permitted her to keep: the photographs, some of the books, the chair from the sitting room. Vivian visited once, in July. She didn't tell Charlotte she was going. She went on a Tuesday afternoon and Margaret made coffee, and they sat at a small table in a room that was a compressed version of every room they'd ever shared. And they did not talk about the accounts or the letter or the will amendment. They talked about the chair. Margaret had put it by the window again, the way it had always been. The view different now, but the positioning identical. And about the building's noisy upstairs neighbor, and about a book Margaret was reading that Vivian had read in college and remembered liking. When Vivian was leaving, Margaret stood in the doorway of the apartment and said, "You look like him more every time I see you." Vivian stopped with her hand on the hallway railing. "Is that hard for you?" she said, not accusing, just asking. Margaret considered it. "No," she said, "not anymore." Vivian nodded and went down the stairs. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building for a moment and let the July heat land on her face and thought about what it meant that she had gone there and that she intended to go again, not regularly, not as restoration of something, but occasionally, in the way you return to a place that has harmed you when you've decided that the harm doesn't get to own the place. Her mother was alive. She was complicit and she was damaged, and she had loved Thomas Whitmore in whatever complicated way she had been capable of loving him. And she was alive. And Vivian was her daughter, and those facts existed alongside everything else and would continue to. She walked to the corner and hailed a cab and got in. So, Alexander Blackwood came to her office on a Wednesday morning in August, which was 3 months after the airport and 4 months after the ballroom, and significantly after any of the formal business between them had concluded. He came alone, without the men who usually occupied his peripheral spaces, and he sat across from her at the desk she'd installed in the office she'd taken on the 28th floor of a building on Madison Avenue. Her office, her name on the lease, her name on the door, and drank the coffee her assistant brought without asking how he took it, which was black, which she had known. She had told him once, during one of the operational conversations in the building with no sign, that she intended to build something, not restore her father's company. That was gone, or too changed to be restored, and she was not her father in the literal sense. Build something new with the capital that had been recovered and the knowledge she'd accumulated about financial structures and offshore entities and the mechanisms of consequence, which turned out to be a highly transferable education. He said, across the desk, "You look different." "From when?" "From the ballroom." She thought about it. "I probably am different. The good kind. I'm not sure those are always distinguishable from the outside." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to understand as his version of amusement, which was very restrained and most visible in the quality of his attention. "Your father would have liked this office," he said. "He would have said the ceiling was too low. And then he would have liked it." She looked at the desk, at the papers on it, the files Gerald had sent over, the legal pad where she'd been drafting notes for a meeting that afternoon with two women who wanted to bring her into a joint investment structure she'd been examining for 3 weeks, with the careful, unhurried thoroughness she'd inherited from a man with a fountain pen and a Poe method, and a note hidden in an envelope his daughter found when she finally needed to find it. "Thomas saved my life once," Alexander said, not metaphorically. He said it without drama, the way he said most things. "I was 27. And I was in a situation that had no good exits, and he was the only person with both the means and the reason to care what happened. He did something that cost him something, and he never mentioned it again." She looked at him. "I've been waiting 25 years to balance that," he said. "I'm telling you this because it's done now. What I owe Thomas is paid." He met her eyes. "What happens from here is different." "Different how?" she said. "Between us. If there's something between us. I'm asking." She was quiet for a moment. The office sounds, the building's ventilation, traffic from Madison Avenue 28 floors below, the distant sound of her assistant on a phone call, continued around the quiet. She thought about what she knew about Alexander Blackwood. She knew he was a man whose world operated in the space between law and order, that his power was real and maintained through means she didn't fully examine, that he'd been present at every critical moment in the last 5 months in the way that some people are present, not intrusively, not with ownership, but with a consistency that accumulated into something she didn't have a clean name for. She thought about what she knew about herself, that she had been built back from something and was not finished being built, that she was 41 years old and had paid a very high tuition for a very specific education and intended to use it, that she was her father's daughter and her mother's daughter and Charlotte's sister, and the woman who had walked into a ballroom in a silver-white dress with 6 months of preparation and a plan, and had discovered, in the execution of the plan, that what she was actually doing was something larger and harder and less clean than revenge. What she was actually doing was finding out who she was when the people who told her otherwise were no longer in the room. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said. He nodded. No disappointment in it, just acknowledgement, the acceptance of a timeline that made sense for what it was. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He looked at the office, the desk and the files and the legal pad and the view through the window of the city that had been the site of everything, with an expression that was not approval exactly, but was adjacent to it. 6 months, he said. 6 months, she said. He walked out and the door closed and she sat at her desk and picked up her pen. Outside, Manhattan moved the way it always had. Indifferent, relentless, lit up, and loud. 38 years of her life had been spent in this city in some version of accommodation, adjusting herself to the dimensions of what other people needed her to be or believed she was or tried to make her into. Her father's daughter, her mother's elder child, Ethan's wife, the woman at the table, the woman being humiliated, the woman who was expected to break. She pulled the legal pad toward her and wrote 3 words at the top of the page. The name of the entity she was filing papers for on Friday, the name of the thing she was building, and looked at them. They were her words. Her name, her choice, arrived at without consultation. She had not asked anyone if it was right. She knew it was right. She put the pen down and looked out the window at the city and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific, uncomplicated sensation of occupying her own life. Not fighting for it, not surviving it, not managing the damage done to it by people who had mistaken her patience for passivity. Just living in it. The window was large and the light was good, and she had a meeting in 40 minutes and a legal pad with 3 words on it and a pen and enough time before either of those things to simply sit and be the woman she had arrived at the hard way. She sat. She breathed. Outside, 38 floors below, the city continued without her permission, which was exactly as it should be, which was, she understood now, the whole point, that the world does not arrange itself around you, that the people who believe it does are the ones who end up on their knees in ballrooms in front of 300 witnesses, that the only arrangement worth having is the one you build yourself, in your own name, with your own hands, from whatever is left after the storm passes through. She was what was left. She was enough.